You've probably heard of at least one of Victorian London's infamous slums, such as St Giles or Seven Dials, and if we dive a little deeper into the capital's rookeries, you might even know the name of some of its most notorious thoroughfares, like Dorset Street or the Old Nickel. But have you ever heard of the worst street in Edwardian London and why it gained such a notorious reputation? Despite the passing of time, some of these sinks of desperate poverty and shocking crime were much the same in the early 1900s as they were in the Victorian era. But people come and go, and the arrival of an opportunistic slum landlord and a few bad characters might see the reputation of a once respectable street decline to such an extent that it became a place even the police feared to tread. Today, in an eyewitness account by the Edwardian journalist Olive Christian Malvery, you will discover the very worst of London streets and the dangerous people that called it home. Malvery was concerned with the welfare of women and children. Born in Lahore in 1871, she moved to London in 1900 and trained to be a singer at the Royal College of Music and supported herself by writing. Awarded a commission for Pearson's magazine, she disguised herself to report on the living and working conditions of everyday people. Little did Malvery know what terrible sights were in store for her when she accompanied the Salvation Army on their charity mission into the most fearsome of Edwardian streets. Find out why the street was shunned by all but the very lowest. Amongst dirty, dark, insanitary hovels, where crime was rampant and suffering endless, she was soon to witness a night of horrors, never to forget. Before we move on, for more content like this, please consider clicking the subscribe button. If you find this video interesting, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up and share it widely with friends and family. Please check out the description to see how you can support the channel and the content we make. My experience in the Salvation Army shelters and the help and sympathy extended by Salvationists to those in dire need made me eager to examine for myself the effect of their work on the evil characters in really bad neighbourhoods. So, when the opportunity presented itself, I seized it. Now I know how it is that we sleep secure in our comfortable beds when thousands are homeless, and how it is that despair and passion do not urge desperate, starving creatures to riot and murder. It is because, unknown to the careless world, numbers of God's patient, loving servants devote their lives to caring for these dread people. Believe me, it is not the law and the police who effectually keep down awful demonstrations of crime. It is the divine labour and love of all those men and women who, being lost to the world, ceaselessly toil and suffer for humanity. I think it was the bonny face peeping out from under the hideous poke bonnet of blue adorned with a red badge of the Salvation Army that won me to an interest in the peculiar work the owner was engaged in. She was standing where rushing streams of London traffic made crossing impossible, and we waited on an island, clinging to a lamp-post to keep our balance, for the refugees were crowded thick. She raised her head, and a sudden smile illuminated her freckled face. My heart went out to her instantly. She looked so bright and wholesome, and as the girls say down Hoxton way, we spoke. She told me as we rollicked citywards on the top of a bumpy bus that she had been into the country on exchange duty, another sister taking her place for 3 weeks on outpost duty. She had enjoyed her holiday, if holiday it might be called, considering that she was at work the whole time, but it was the change into the pure air and a sight of the trees and grass she had revelled in. And now she returned to the great city, fresh as a country flower, and as good to meet. She laughed merrily when I inquired innocently as to the meaning of outpost duty, slum sister, and other unfamiliar expressions she used, and said, "Why, sister, I guess you'd better come along with me to my room, and you'll find out for yourself what it all means." I was not able just then to accompany her, but before we reached Liverpool Street, she had given me her address, and I had promised to meet her some day at a place named by her not far from where her work lay. "As yet," she said, "we have not gone to live exactly at the worst spot, but Lieutenant Francis and I mean to get there yet. Some months after this meeting, when my heart was sore with much contact with poverty and misery, and I was burning not only to touch the heart of things, but to see some way out of the awful slough of crime and misery for the miserable creatures I had been travelling among, I thought, in my indignation and despair, of Captain Molly, and wrote, claiming her promise to show me light in dark places. After the delay of a few days, I received her answer, asking me to meet her at the barracks. I went. "Well, I'm just as glad as can be to see you. I thought you had forgotten," she said. "But are you sure, my dear, you realize what you are undertaking? It isn't a pleasant place for strangers, where I live." "I am not afraid," I said. "If you can live there, I can visit there." "It isn't quite the same thing," she said. "Besides, you see, my uniform's a protection. If I can come with you, I shall wear a uniform also, if you will let me." She looked dubious. "Sit down," she said, "and we'll talk and pray over it." We were in a little bare room. A picture of the Divine Master praying in the garden hung on the whitewashed wall. In the picture the face was lifted to heaven, and the yearning look in the eyes moved one to pity for a love that could so hunger for the outcast and the needy. Captain Molly saw me look at the picture. "Can you understand it?" she said. "I think so," I answered quietly. "It seems so sorrowful that so many human creatures should be wasted." She came and put her hand on my shoulder. "Come, if you feel like that." "I don't know," said Captain Molly, as we walked towards her, post some days afterwards, both of us wearing the sombre dress of the Soldiers of Salvation, "that it really is the worst street in London. But about here, the police and others say it is, and I don't think it would be easy to beat it anywhere." We were threading our way through crowds in a narrow street flanked by barrows and coster stalls. I noticed the folk made way for us as we went, and Captain Molly acknowledged all courtesies with a word or smile, and by we came to a dingy court, which seemed a veritable plague spot, the haunt, as I afterwards learnt, of thieves and bad characters, and this was Green Arbour Court. Ye shades, what a place! "And why," I asked my companion, "do they call it Green Arbour Court?" She smiled a trifle sadly. "The authority who christened it must have been an ironical wag, and named it for its oppositeness to its title. Or, maybe," she said slowly, "once it was green and good, even here. One might imagine the place, from its name, a spot redolent of flowers and melodious with song, instead of being, as it is, a group of dirty, dark, insanitary hovels, where the death rate is 4 times as high as any street in its immediate neighbourhood, a slum shunned by all but the very lowest, a modern Alsatia, a close borough of blackguardism, visited by the police only at rare intervals, and then only in couples, practically ignored by the sanitary authorities, excepting on the occasion when the fever ambulance takes away one of its inhabitants, a victim, perhaps, to diphtheria or some other infectious horror, born in the vile miasma arising from its filth and uncleanliness. For very obvious reasons, it is impossible for me to do more than barely indicate the exact locality of this wretched place. It is situated in the east of London, and its only entrance leads from a well-known thoroughfare. It was on a humid autumn evening that I first entered this narrow, paved court. It seemed as if I had entered an oven. The sun had beaten on the houses all day, and owing to the lack of ventilation, the small rooms had become absolutely unbearable to the inhabitants. The heat had driven nearly every inmate of the houses out of doors. Those who were not in the public house that stood on one side of the entrance to the court were sitting on the doorsteps or paving in front of their houses. Quarrelsome, hot, dirty, and semi-clothed children were crawling about or sitting on the hard stones, and every corner seemed alive. So much so that I feared I would have to step on someone if I wished to pass up the court at all. Little wonder that the place echoed with bad language, and words not of the gentlest. "Do you really live here?" I asked of Captain Molly. "Surely," she said, and I followed her obediently up the rickety stairway of a tenement house. At the third story we halted on the tiny landing, and I noticed it was the only clean spot we had passed since entering the court. Captain Molly took out a key from her pocket, and we entered her station. She had 2 rooms opening into each other. The matchboarding between them was painted a pretty green, and hung with lovely prints in reed frames. I noticed they were fixed on with brass nails. "My sister gave those to me," said Captain Molly, mentioning a name well known in London society. There was no covering on the floor, save a small mat, and it was enamelled a pretty dark brown. The chairs were enamelled in green to match the partition, and the table was brown like the floor. There was a big, rough, green jar of growing ferns in the window, and a blackbird in a cage hung there also. We went into the little bedroom. It was painted in dark blue, and a narrow truckle bed and 1 small trunk were the chief bits of furniture. Beside a tall rush-bottomed chair was a tiny slip of carpet. A little table held a few books, and on the wall, above a small shelf, hung a 6-inch looking-glass. "Just to show if the helmet's on straight," laughed Captain Molly. "I pay 6 shillings a week for this place," said Captain Molly, "and am better provided with room than any of my neighbours." The remembrance of my first night in that place will stay with me always. We went out to a meeting that evening, and returned eager to rest. But all through the night it was a pandemonium. There were horrid shouts and oaths, and sometimes a woman's scream and the cry of a terrified child broke through the babel of noise. About 3 o'clock a knock came on our door. Captain Molly got up. A man stood outside, haggard and awful-looking. "My girl's dying out there," he said. On the steps of one of the houses, propped against the wall, sat a wasted girl, panting for breath. At Captain Molly's command, the man carried her up to our room. We laid a blanket on the floor and bathed her face with cold water. It was all marred and disfigured with marks of many battles. Once she spoke in broken gasps. "Get older, Tom. He ain't a bad lot." The man heard and bent down. The girl was dead. Remembering her words, Tom let Captain get hold of him, and became a valued helper and guide. For a time I hung on to Captain Molly's skirts, till gradually I grew more familiar with the place, and made acquaintance with some of our neighbours. One of the first persons I came to know in the house was a woman, who, with several other persons and a number of children, occupied a room on the next landing to ours. One night I had stumbled over her in the dark, when she was lying in a drunken sleep on the stairs near our room. At first I thought she was ill, and fetched a light to see how I could help her, but I soon discovered that she was insensibly drunk, and also she had received a fall, and had badly cut her forehead. There was quite a pool of blood where she lay. Making a bandage by tearing up one of our towels, I first bathed, and then bound up the wound. Then, getting assistance, I had her taken to her room. Through this act of common duty, an acquaintanceship sprang up between us, from which I gathered a great deal of knowledge. From her I learned much of the habits of our neighbours. Of course, many things that she told me would be utterly impossible to relate, and can only here be hinted at. From her I learned that most of the men in the house were hawks, or deadbents, as she called common thieves. Nearly all of them had at some period of their lives done time, that is, been in prison. Several had been bashed, or, in other words, flogged in prison for the crime of robbery with violence. Crimes of the very worst description were openly and sympathetically discussed, and one cannot help wondering why the authorities allow such a hotbed of sin to exist. That they know of its existence, the periodical visits of the police testify. But I suppose even thieves must live somewhere, and perhaps it is thought best that they should congregate in a colony where they can be, as it were, under the eye of the police, who often visited this locality at night, in order to find, if possible, some notorious criminal. This the people themselves call turning them over. Not an individual in the place appeared to earn an honest livelihood. Boys started off in the morning in gangs, like wolves in search of prey. Men went into the country to do jobs, which did not mean, as one might be led to believe, the carrying out of some respectable employment, but was the term applied to the committing of some well-planned crime, generally directed by one of the heads, as these master criminals are called. Young and old, feeble and strong, all were engaged in crime. The tiniest boys and girls crawled into shops, after the box, as they called stealing tills, a kind of robbery inflicted on the small shopkeepers in the neighbourhood, and causing them much annoyance. The youths and young women infested the dark thoroughfares on the lookout for helpless women or drunken mugs, as they called their victims, in order to beat and rob them, while the greybeards of this banditti planned burglaries and crimes of a more daring or dastardly nature. It was in this neighbourhood that I first came into actual contact with people who, at least one to another, openly admitted that they were thieves and vagabonds, though later, in company with a friend, I made a closer study of the criminal class. These criminal exploits and nefarious projects were discussed as calmly and quietly as many more respectable friends discussed their daily business. As may be imagined, it required a good deal of patience and something of tact to gain the confidence of these people, and Captain Molly's friendship for me was a guarantee of my faith. Then, too, little acts of common charity, assistance in case of an accident, advice in illness, all these things help towards establishing a friendly feeling. Honour amongst thieves obtains to a much greater extent than one would suppose. Low as these people are, there is a viler being, the police-paid spy, often a thief himself, who lives with and on his companions in crime, and then betrays them. These contemptible mouchards, police informers, are known as coppers' narcs. They are not officially recognized, of course, but they are great factors in the discovery of crime and criminals, and from the point of view of law and order must be considered useful. But the arm of the law is not long enough to reach these people and drag them into respectability, nor is it strong enough to sweep them and their rat-holes away and force them to decent living. It is the soldiers on outpost duty, the slum sisters, who here are stronger than the law, and are instrumental in winning many a young life from criminality. I discovered, while here, that vile and cruel as many of these people are, there are some sparks of humanity in most of them, and I cannot believe that they are utterly and wholly lost. I truly believe that if some method could be found by which they could be approached in a common sense and kindly fashion, that the children, at least, could be educated out of their criminal ways. It is not enough that here and there a slum sister carries the torch of civilization and Christianity among them. For their own protection, all decent citizens should cooperate to demand good housing and sanitary laws and compulsory work for able-bodied men at a fair living wage. This could be done by forming small committees, who could occupy rooms in the very centres of these hotbeds of crime. Much good and useful work could be done from these centres. Advice in time of need, medical and surgical assistance, organised charity, enforcement of the Public Health Acts, and 101 other useful duties which would be sure to have a good effect on the lives of the people watched over. I know that there are many missions doing good and useful work besides the Salvation Army, but I am afraid that most of the effort is spent upon that well-cared-for class, the deserving poor. I enter a plea also for the undeserving criminal, and the class of work should be extended that is done by the slum sisters of the Salvation Army in such places as I have described. The Public Health, London, Act inflicts penalties in respect of having premises in a state dangerous to health, also in the matter of overcrowding. But who is there to enforce this law? In Green Arbour Court, no sanitary inspector ever came. The houses were almost all owned by one man, and they were all rack-rented, the charging of excessive rent. In the one next to ours, 30 people lived, and the aggregate rent for the house amounted to about £140. Most of the houses had no street doors, and the stairs were broken and unsafe, and many a piece of rope took the place of banisters and handrails. How often in the gathering dark Captain Molly would go down to the end of the court opposite the pub, and there stand with her face upraised and sing holy words that seemed to purify the tainted air. Once a girl came by, and acting on some strange, vile impulse, threw a rotten orange at the captain. It struck her full in the chest and spattered over her gown. She turned to the girl with, "You poor child!" The creature yelled out, "God blast you!" and rushed laughing down the street. The meeting went on. Captain Molly spoke wonderful words to the strange creatures round her. That night about 12 o'clock there was a knocking at the door. Captain Molly opened the door and brought in the girl who had thrown the orange. She was covered with blood and dirt, and trembling and sobbing. After a while we learnt her trouble. Her bloke had bashed her for being unsuccessful in picking pockets at the train terminus, and as he had administered his chastisement in public, the police had captured him and walked him off for trial. He had split open one policeman's head, so his sentence was sure to be a severe one. Poor Red Meg, as the girl was called, was in great distress. In her sore and forlorn condition, she came to Captain Molly. The last I heard of her was that she was serving in a country shop, boots and shoes, and was much valued by her employers. She was waiting and praying for a change of heart for her bloke, and divided her spare pence between the Salvation Army prison mission and a little hoard she was gathering to make a home when the bloke was released. Captain Molly will take care he is met at the prison gate, and helped to a new life, if he so wishes. In many of the noisome places of our great cities, among the slum dwellers, there settle these devoted slum sisters, living generally two together. We may never read the record of their golden deeds, but their names must be inscribed in letters of gold in God's book of life, for they have added many souls to his kingdom.